Hello and welcome to another very exciting episode of Social Studies. Today we are on 6.2, The Road to the Civil War, Part 1, or the timeline to the Civil War, or the long fuse leading to the stick of dynamite known as the Civil War, Part 1. Okay, so it might be helpful to have this sheet out to look on to help you out, but if not, this is the one we're going to be filling in. So by the end of this, you should have the front of this filled in, not the rest, just the front. All right, so we're going to start off here with the Declaration of Independence, which we've talked about before, but what does that have to do with anything? And what does that have to do with slavery? As you see, this fuse, it consists of slavery. So Declaration of Independence is in 1776. Hopefully you know the exact date to put in there. But if you just put 1776, that will be acceptable. But hopefully you know, because you celebrate it every year, what date that would be. Okay, now the Declaration of Independence, as you know, states all men are created equal. And in 1776, that of course was not necessarily the case. But that argument, that those words in this document are going to be very, very important and a very important tool to help more and more people gain freedom and equal rights within our country and around the world, incidentally. So it makes it more difficult to justify or defend slavery. It's really hard to argue in favor of slavery when our whole country is based on this idea that all men are created equal. Okay, and as my phone keeps going off, no matter what time I do this, it doesn't matter. Apparently, people sense it and they start texting right when I start recording. Okay, moving on. 1787. I'm not letting the phone distract me. I'm not checking my messages. I'm continuing to work. I should put my phone in the other room. That would be even better, wouldn't it? All right, anyways, 1787, as you know, important year because that was the Constitutional Convention. But something else happened in 1787 that is lesser known. This was the Constitution was written at the Constitutional Convention in 1787, but before that, before we replaced it, our old Constitution, as you hopefully remember, was the Articles of Confederation. And if you remember anything about the Articles of Confederation, there's two facts you should know. It's the first Constitution of the United States, and under the Articles of Confederation, the national government was too weak. The national government was too weak. All right, remember that. Now, this is the thing. The national government that was so weak, we did not really talk about them accomplishing anything, but they did accomplish something. Even though they didn't accomplish much, they accomplished passing a law called the Northwest Ordinance. The Northwest Ordinance is the name of the law. And this was the government, the Continental Congress, basically, because that's all the national government was. But it did manage to pass this law called the Northwest Ordinance. The Northwest Ordinance was a law passed by the weak national government under the Articles of Confederation. It made slavery illegal in the Northwest Territory. Remember, this is the Northwest Territory, north of the Ohio River, east of the Mississippi, around the Great Lakes. This was land gained from Britain after the Revolutionary War. And before people started settling there, before we did anything, before we set it up and organized it, the Congress decided we were not going to allow slavery in this area. They were going to make slavery illegal. And this is going to be the first federal law to limit slavery, first federal law to put restrictions on slavery and say there's no slavery. Now, some states like Massachusetts had already outlawed slavery, but this is the first time the federal government is stepping in and saying, we're not going to have slavery in that Northwest Territory. All right, moving on. Constitutional Convention. Now, you know all about the Constitutional Convention, and if not, you might want to pause right now and go watch the award-winning miniseries, The Constitutional Convention, available in Schoology or on Netflix, at least in Schoology. I'm not sure if it's still on Netflix. Anyways, there are two compromises that involved slavery: the Slave Trade Compromise and the Three-Fifths Compromise. So in your notes here, we should have filled in this part already. Okay, the North. So you're putting the year 1776, 1787. This was the first federal law to outlaw slavery. That's what you're writing there. This was difficult to justify or defend slavery. All right. Constitutional Convention, also 1787, two major compromises involving slavery. The first one is the Slave Trade Compromise. Slave Trade Compromise protected the slave trade for 20 years. They said Congress could not even discuss ending the slave trade for 20 years because they were worried this new federal government might use its power to outlaw slavery. So they protected slavery and the slave trade for 20 years. Also, the other one that involved slavery, of course, was the Three-Fifths Compromise. The Three-Fifths Compromise said when taking the census to count the population of each state, they would count 3 out of every 5 slaves for determining representation in the House of Representatives. All right, so that you should have filled in. Moving on down our timeline now, we're going to skip ahead to 1820, but we're going to talk a little bit about what goes on in these years in between 1787 and 1820. So on the notes, we're going to just not fill in this part for a moment. We will in a moment, but for now, we're going to skip down to these boxes down here, which are kind of filling us in on what's going on, not just throughout the early to mid 1800s, basically. So during the early to mid 1800s, slavery was outlawed in all states north of the blank and blank river. Right, so what are we going to put here? Well, this is a time period, as you know from previously, the abolition movement is starting to gain some strength. People working to try to abolish or end slavery. However, at the same time, the population of enslaved people is increasing dramatically. And you can see the number of slaves is going up from, in 1800, less than a million to 1860, 4 million. It's going up substantially. People thought that the slave trade was going to, once the slave trade ended, that slavery would kind of die out on its own. Instead, it takes off. And this is one reason why right here, the cotton production, the invention of the cotton gin and the spinning jenny and textile mills, they create this huge demand for cotton. And as cotton goes up and cotton production goes up, the number of slaves goes up too. Here's another way of looking at it. This is what happens with cotton production in the United States. It skyrockets. And along with that, as cotton production goes up, the enslaved population goes up as well. All right. Now, because of the abolition movement and because of the Declaration of Independence, slavery had been outlawed in the North. Now, this is kind of the unofficial boundary between the North and South. It's a line called the Mason-Dixon line. If you ever travel to Maryland or south of Pennsylvania, once you cross that southern Pennsylvania border, you are crossing into what at least used to be considered the South. Now it's not so much necessarily, but still unofficially, sometimes this is referred to as the separation between the North and the South. A famous line called the Mason-Dixon line, named after the people who actually measured this. They were surveyors who, in the late 1600s, early 1700s, they measured and surveyed and laid out this Mason-Dixon line. So next time you go down to Maryland for a lacrosse tournament or something, or down to DC to visit the Capitol building or whatever you're doing, look for that Mason-Dixon line. Okay, so this is a separation. And then we have the Ohio River. Up here north, this is the Ohio River. The southern border of Ohio is the Ohio River. North of this is in the Northwest Territory. Slavery had been outlawed there. So keep that in mind because we'll help fill in the notes in a second. Here's a good picture that shows how slavery had been was allowed in the South, but not in the North at this point. Okay, and so we had this delicate balance between free states. Free states, of course, are states where slavery is illegal or had been outlawed, and slave states where slavery was allowed. And by 1819, we had 22 states, and we had a balance exactly of 11 free states and 11 slave states. So to fill in these notes here, let me go back up to make sure we have the right one. All right, so I can read them word for word with you. During the early to mid 1800s, slavery was outlawed in all states north of the Mason-Dixon line, and Ohio River. But slavery increased rapidly in the South. During the early mid 1800s, slavery became much more profitable and grew quickly in the South as a result of the textile industry and the invention of the cotton gin. Textile industry and cotton gin. All right, moving on to this one in the Missouri Compromise. So let me see. In 1819, this balance is going to come into danger, I guess, because Missouri, right here, this yellow state right here, Mo is the abbreviation for Missouri. Mo is ready to become a state, and it applies for statehood. It meets the other constitutional requirements to become a state. However, it wants to have slaves. It wants to allow slavery. And allowing Missouri to become a slave state is going to tip the balance in the Senate, where it's going to tip the balance in the Senate in favor of the southern slave states. Now, in the North, there would still be a larger population in the North, so the House of Representatives in the North would have an advantage. But in the South, or in the Senate, this would give the South advantage. So in 1820, Missouri asked to join the U.S. as a slave state. The northern free states objected. They said, no way, we can't do that, because this would tip the balance between slave states and free states in the Senate when they asked to join the Union. Important point here, if you don't know it, start to remember. During the 1800s, the United States was very, very often referred to as the Union. Almost more than it was called the United States, we called ourselves the Union. So the Union, when you joined the Union, that was joining the United States. We still sometimes use this, usually about once a year, when the president delivers the State of the Union address. So the Union refers to the United States. So Missouri here wants to become a state, a slave state. It's going to tip the balance. Congress has to approve it. Congress says, no, we can't do that. The northern states. Now, the thing is, southern states are getting really angry about this. They're saying there's no way, you can't keep them out. They meet all of the constitutional requirements. You can't keep them out just because they want to have slavery. Slavery is legal, of course, in these southern states. So Henry Clay, you might remember Henry Clay. Henry Clay was the person who was a war hawk. He was a senator for a long time. He ran for president several times. But Henry Clay comes up with a compromise, and this is what the compromise is going to be. Yes, Missouri, we will let you in. We will make Missouri a slave state. That's going to tip the balance, right? Well, you would think so, except let's go back up north here to Maine. Maine up here. Now, you might remember way back in colonial times when we were drawing a picture or looking at pictures of the 13 colonies, and you saw Massachusetts had two different pieces. They weren't connected. Maine was part of Massachusetts. So now, as part of this compromise, what they're going to do is break off Maine and create a new free state called Maine, and that's going to keep the balance. So we'll add one slave state and one free state. So that is part of the compromise here, keeping the balance here between slave states and free states. In the industrial north here gets Maine, and in the southern slave states, they are going to get Missouri. So that's going to tip the balance. Keep the balance. So the parts of this compromise: number one, Missouri joins the Union or the U.S. as a slave state. 2, Maine becomes a free state. And now my phone is ringing. Let me pause momentarily, if I can. Okay, back to the Missouri Compromise. Sorry for the interruptions. Hopefully, I can get through this time. We're filling in the notes here, talking about the parts of the Missouri Compromise. So we talked about this. Missouri joins the Union as a slave state, Maine as a free state to keep the balance. Keep the balance. All right. Third part, though, they're thinking ahead. What's going to happen with the rest of this land out west? How do we stop this? Like we almost came to blows here. We almost had a civil war when Missouri asked to join the Union. Remember, 1819, John Adams and Thomas Jefferson were still alive at that point, and they're still writing their letters back and forth, and they talk about they worry that this Missouri question, this Missouri problem is going to be the downfall of our country, and it's going to split us apart and destroy our country because they just don't see a solution. This is going to be the solution. But now they're worried, how do we stop this from happening, again in a couple of years when we go to add another state? So they come up with this plan called the Missouri Compromise. They say slavery is going to be outlawed in the rest of that Louisiana territory above the 3630 north latitude line, except for Missouri. We'll look at a map and I'll show you in a second. That's the southern border of Missouri. So except for Missouri, which will be a slave state, everything else above that line is going to be free. That's how they're going to settle this problem for years to come. It's called the Missouri Compromise line. So let's look at this map here. If you look, do I no longer have let me see if I can get my laser pointer. Okay, there we go. Right here, this Missouri Compromise line. So they say purple here is slave, green is free. They say, okay, we will allow Missouri to be a slave state, but then the southern border here, we're not going to allow slavery anywhere else above this line. So all of this, they're calling it the Missouri Territory now, but what used to be the Louisiana Purchase Territory, all of this, there's not going to be slavery. It's going to be free up here. And down here, they can add more slave states, but not above this line. Now, remember, all of this grayish, brownish area here is not yet the United States. So this is the edge of the United States at that point in 1820. So that's what the Missouri Compromise is. Let me just see if we filled in everything here. The three-part compromise. So Missouri Compromise 1820, disagreement between North and South. When Missouri asked to join the Union as a slave state, this would tip the balance in between free and slave states in the Senate. Three-part compromise. The Missouri becomes a slave state. 2, Maine is admitted as a free state. Maine admitted as free state. And 3, slavery outlawed or banned or illegal north, underline north, of Missouri's southern border, except for Missouri, aka the Missouri Compromise line, which is 3630 north latitude, 3630. All right, we're gonna pause and not do these two parts right here. So don't worry about these two boxes. We will pick up these two boxes next time. All right, that is all I have for now. So have a pleasant day.